What's going on, everyone? My name is Curci, and I want to talk about why Bloodborne is amazing. Now, I know I already made a review for Bloodborne, which I did after my first run at the game, but upon completing it, I realized that there was a significant amount of stuff that I had missed. Some optional bosses, all of the Chalice dungeons, the Old Hunters DLC, a secret ending, and after rolling credits on the game, much like what happened upon my completion of Dark Souls, I wanted more, but unlike Dark Souls, there was enough in Bloodborne to pull me back in. So I decided to load up a new game plus, and when I did this, as I started making my way through the numerous Chalice dungeons and facing the grueling test that was the DLC bosses, I began developing new opinions on the game that I did not originally have when recording the review. It was enough that I wanted to make a whole new video about, one where I could write out all of my thoughts and carefully articulate what I think about this game. For clarity, I still stand by my general opinions that were stated in my review. Bloodborne is a great game, assuming that this is the type of game you were expecting to experience. If you were expecting the classic From Software experience of testing your skills at the cost of dying over and over again, but all the while learning from each previous failed run, then this is certainly the game for you. However, in my original review, I highlighted my general disappointment with the game's bosses, mainly that the bosses of Bloodborne are so easily toppled by utilizing the same strategy of aggressiveness over and over again. On this point, I wanted to elaborate, which to be fair is the main motivation to wanting to make this video. I felt like I didn't really explain what I meant in the review all that well. But more than that, there was something I had learned during my second run of Bloodborne that I had not realized the first time playing. Oh, and I just want to offer up a spoiler warning. There's not much to spoil in the way of story, nor do I particularly plan to, but if you wanted to play this game with a fresh set of eyes without having some of the bosses revealed to you in this video, then you might want to give the game a try and come back later. But if you've already beaten the game or you simply don't care, then off we go to spoiler land. When you first start out Bloodborne, you probably already played one of From Software's previous titles called Dark Souls. Now that game in itself is great, but why it's great explains why someone would want to play something like Bloodborne. Dark Souls is easily described as being a harshly difficult game, a game that punishes you by making every enemy feel difficult to overcome, the bosses seeming like a mountain of a challenge to climb, and checkpoints that are so few and far between, and with each death will respawn all of the enemies in an area. All of this together seems like you're fighting against the current of a river. Of course, saying all of this doesn't exactly sell the game on why it's good, but understanding the game on the surface helps with finding an appreciation for it underneath. It's easy to say that the game is all about taking on hard bosses and feeling triumphant when finally defeating it, but Dark Souls offers more feelings of victory even outside of the boss fights. As you progress, you'll light new bonfires or discover secret shortcuts which make your navigating the world far less painful. All of this feels just as rewarding as overcoming a challenging boss. Every time you die, you are forced to learn from the previously failed run. You begin to build up your gaming calluses as you overcome the terrain, its enemies, and of course the bosses. Each boss is going to present its own challenges, and you're forced to study the boss's moveset while also identifying the best opening to attack. All the while, you're developing your strategy to overcome it. For example, the game's first boss in the Asylum Demon teaches you about plunging attacks, which you immediately start using against the Taurus Demon one boss later. The Capra Demon will have two dogs that are arguably more challenging than the Capra Demon itself, and the Gaping Dragon is not only a uniquely designed boss, but it's best dealt with using bug bites. But in essence, for most of Dark Souls, you are taught to keep your distance and wait for the right moment to strike, all while trying not to get hit. What I liked is that in Dark Souls, it felt like each boss was uniquely challenging. They each presented new moves to learn and overcome. So by the time you start out Bloodborne, you were expecting an experience not too different from that of Dark Souls. And in the general sense, it is similar. You got your areas that twist and turn back into itself while hiding shortcuts and lanterns to give you some reprieve. All the while, you are dealing with enemies that can easily overwhelm and kill you as you attempt to get to the next boss. But it is here where I started noticing a change in the formula. The first boss you likely faced in Bloodborne was the Cleric Beast. I say likely because I recently learned that the Cleric Beast is actually an optional boss. You don't need to go all the way down the bridge toward the Cleric Beast, you can just head down the side and proceed toward Father Gascoigne right away. Still, the Cleric Beast was likely your first boss in Bloodborne, and being the first boss, you probably fought this guy like you did with the bosses of Dark Souls. You kept your distance and waited for an opening. You might have even won with this strategy if you dodged decently enough. The problem is that the Cleric Beast has some reach, so you're actually in its ballpark by doing this. After you've died a couple times, you might have started being aggressive by dodging into it to get your strikes in. This is probably how you bested the first and also optional boss of Bloodborne. So the game teaches you from the very start to be aggressive. When you reach Gascoigne, you're probably still trying to break your old Dark Souls habits. This dude's first two phases are relatively easy to manage, but his third phase, when he transforms into a beast, is where the challenge really begins. After playing it safe, you're now on the receiving end of a relentless attack. If you continue to fight Gascoigne by being careful at this point, you're likely going to be annihilated. Even the music box, which you get from Gascoigne's daughter, which will stun him when played, might not be enough. It'll definitely help sink some damage into him, but you're still going to have to endure the barrage of attacks that follow up. So again, the game teaches you to be aggressive. Get right in there and start swinging. Of course, you're going to have to back off and heal from time to time, but you have to get right back in there. By the time you get to the bloodstarved beast, you've learned to be aggressive, so you try to be up close and fight this beast, only to learn that this guy has the means of countering that kind of playstyle. This works early on in the fight, but once its attacks start to poison you, you become more reserved in your strategy, especially in the boss's third phase, where just being close will poison you. Continuing to press the attack will not only leave you vulnerable to being poisoned frequently, but you're also vulnerable to the bloodstarved beast's grab attack, where you'll say bye-bye to most of your health and most definitely be poisoned by the end of it. So after conditioning you to play aggressive, suddenly the game is telling you to back off, but distance isn't really the answer to this guy either, because Bloodborne isn't exactly best played from a distance. Eventually you need to get close to attack it. This was the initial roadblock for me when playing Bloodborne. It seemed like the bloodstarved beast had a counter to everything. You couldn't always be at range, you had to get close eventually, but even being close leaves you open to the bloodstarved beast's most vicious attacks. Even though I eventually defeated it, it wasn't until my second run through did I learn the strategy to overcome this bastard, which is dodge to the left. The bloodstarved beast's attacks whiff when you time your dodge properly and toward the left. This leaves its one weakness wide open, its back. Even though I was never able to beat this boss on my first try on any of my playthroughs, being up close and dodging to the left meant that I could aggressively attack its rear and be relatively safe. Now this becomes more difficult in the third phase, but avoiding being hit is the name of the game. And so Bloodborne, with its first 3 bosses, taught me 2 different strategies to overcoming bosses. When Dark Souls taught me to keep my distance and wait for an opening, Bloodborne taught me that while that still works, also be aggressive. But more importantly, don't assume you can defeat every boss the same way. With Vicar Amelia, the trick is to be aggressive and up close. Keeping a distance gives her a chance to start healing herself, which for a boss is a big middle finger. The Shadows of Yharnam are all about divide and conquer. Pull one of the shadows from the others and deal with them one at a time. Rom the Vacuous Spider is about crowd control, dealing with the spider mobs while also keeping an eye on what Rom is doing and then getting in strikes once you've leveled the playing field. The Amygdala is all about keeping a distance and striking at the head when you get the chance. But it's the next 3 bosses I faced that stuck with me, and I think ultimately is why I was disappointed with the bosses when I made the review. The next 3 bosses were the One Reborn, Mikolash, and Murgo's Wetners, all of which are handled the exact same way. Get in their face and beat the crap out of them. For the One Reborn, apparently you're meant to take out the witches along the sides of the arena, but my first playthrough, I just ran into that mess of humanity and beat the crap out of it. I couldn't even tell you what moves it had. Now, Mikolash is unique since most of the fight you're spent chasing him through mirrors and dealing with mobs, but once you reach a room where he finally turns to fight you, the best strategy is to just get in his face and cut him to pieces. To be fair, I did die to him a few times because I wanted to play it careful since he had this one-shot kill call from beyond attack, but he only uses this attack if you're at a distance. As long as you can avoid his tentacle attack and getting close, this dude's a pushover. Then there's Murgo's Wetners, who is the final boss before the final boss before the final boss. This fight feels like it's going to be a challenge, but it really isn't. I first beat the Wetners by getting right up in there and slashing away, but with my second playthrough, I just got behind her. As long as you get ready to move, you can topple this boss without too much trouble. Once you get past those low tier boss fights, you end up facing Gehrman the First Hunter. Fighting Gehrman is Bloodborne at its best, as you now have to roll out a strategy that is a mixture of everything you've learned so far. Your best bet is to try parrying him while realizing when to be aggressive and when to back off. Despite this fight being a true challenge for me and everything I wanted from this game, it still didn't quite wash out the simplicity of the last few bosses. So when I did my review, the way I so easily toppled the last few bosses overshadowed how much Bloodborne had forced me to learn and adapt. But I still ached for that challenge, and I realized that I had missed out on a lot that Bloodborne had to offer. There were 4 main game bosses that I had missed, the Chalice dungeons and of course the DLC. First, let's talk about the 4 main game bosses I had missed: Ligarius, the Celestial Emissary, Ibridus, and the Moon Presence. However, the issue I was seeing was still pretty persistent because out of these 4 optional bosses, only one presented somewhat of a challenge, which was Martyr Ligarius. To get to him, you'll first need to make your way to Cainhurst Castle, which, by the way, I can't believe there was a whole area of the game that I had missed, which also happened when I explored the Upper Cathedral and Orphanage while going after Ibridus. Bloodborne actually has a couple of these secret off-the-beaten-path areas that can be easily missed if you're just going forward. But going back to Ligarius, this is a guy that requires a bit of dancing to overcome. What I mean by that is that you could be aggressive, but you'll need to be dodging and watching out for a lot of moves that can tank your health. In addition to this, Ligarius will occasionally plunge his sword into the ground, and if you don't destroy it in time, swords will start raining from the sky and he becomes more vicious himself. This is actually how I died to him the first time. He was still toppled in the follow-up fight once I got the idea of dodging the right moves and drilling in attacks when I could, so he wasn't that much of a problem. However, the same can't be said for the other three. The Celestial Emissary is a joke, just a bunch of big-headed goobers until you find the real one who becomes a big-headed goober and oh, never mind, he's dead. Ebrides has some awesome lore implications and has a cool design, but if you just run to her back and smack it constantly, she's easily beaten. The Moon Presence is pretty cool as the secret final boss of the game, but being the follow-up to the German fight doesn't do it any favors. While I did die to this boss about 4 times, you still beat it by simply being aggressive. Looking back, I see that the brilliance of Bloodborne was teaching the player that they not only had to adopt multiple playstyles to achieve victory, but also conditioning the player that you can't just do the same thing over and over because things get mixed up enough that each boss is its own unique encounter. This holds true from the Cleric Beast, which tells you can't play this like Dark Souls, to the Bloodstarved Beast, which teaches you can't always be aggressive. Then Rom tells you take everything you think you know and do something different. And finally with Gehrman, where the game demands you put your best foot forward and get good enough to best the first hunter. But when the game spends most of its time teaching you to stay on your toes, toward the end it goes, never mind, as the bosses feel more and more like a pushover. This is why when I did my review, my takeaway was being formed by the last few bosses I faced. I remember there being decent challenges, but the fresher memories are that of the One Reborn, Mikolash, and the Wet Nurse. And when you think on the bad, you start to only see the bad. The Cleric Beast, Gascoigne, Parl, all were beaten with aggressiveness, while the Amygdala, the Shadows of Yharnam, the Hemwick Witches were easily toppled after just one go. Now add in the Celestial Emissary and Ebrides, and you get more bosses that are easily defeated using the same aggressive strategy or are defeated within one attempt. The Chalice dungeons weren't that much better because 15 of the first 16 boss fights fall into this category. Oh yes, and I did say 16, which speaks to the mind-numbing repetitive gameplay that is the Chalice dungeons. After defeating the Bloodstarved Beast, you'll find your very first Chalice, which you can use in the Hunter's Dream to perform a ritual and create your first Chalice dungeon. You get more Chalices as you progress within these dungeons. Now the layout of the Chalice dungeons are pretty simple. You go from room to room, clearing out the enemies until you find a lever which unlocks the door toward the boss's room. You then defeat the boss to gain access to an elevator which will take you down to the next layer and then repeat the process. Now these dungeons are, according to the game's lore, the Tomb of the Gods that Gehrman tells you about, and is also where the Yharnamites find the ancient blood that they use for healing but also results in people turning into monsters. And not for nothing, but the atmosphere of these tombs are pretty cool for the first Chalice, but when you realize that every Chalice has the same copy and pasted rooms, the same ambient sound, the same general formula, these Chalice dungeons live out their welcome once you reach the second Chalice. The Chalice dungeons are easily the worst part of Bloodborne. And because I was tackling these Chalices with my new Game Plus character, 15 of the first 16 bosses I encountered were straight up pushovers. I hit a bit of a roadblock with the Undead Giant that has the chain balls for a back. I actually liked this boss fight because it had an answer for the aggressive strategy of get behind the enemy and attack away. This works for a little bit, but eventually this dude is going to be like, nope, and swing his chain ball back and tank your health. And this boss is right in the middle of the 16, so I ripped through the Chalice bosses, had some trouble with this guy, and ripped through the rest. That is until I hit the Defiled Chalice. Unlike most Chalices, the Defiled Chalice comes with a little extra challenge. Your normal health is cut in half, so suddenly you're being a lot more careful and everything is terrifying. It was within this Chalice when I faced the Chalice Dungeon Trio, or that's what I'm going to call them anyway. The Keeper of the Old Lords, the Watchdog of the Old Lords, which by the way, calling them the Old Lords and their thing being fire makes me think that they're actually a Dark Souls reference, which I appreciate, and another Amygdala. These three gave me some of the biggest trouble in my entire run of Bloodborne. The thing with the Keeper of the Old Lords is that while it isn't hard to get in and do some damage since he flinches when you hit him, it's his quick and hard-hitting follow-ups that can be devastating, especially in his second phase when he imbues his sword with fire. So in the first phase, when being aggressive has some big payoffs, in his second phase, flipping this script and being cautious is what helps. If you aren't being careful, this dude can one-hit kill you or get you into a combo which will feel like a one-hit kill. This dude is quick, and when he wants to attack you, he will close the gap and keep pressing. He killed me 12 times before I finally bested him. Once you overcome that challenge, one level down you get to face the Watchdog of the Old Lords, who is actually the final boss of the very first Chalice, and if you were super over-leveled for the Chalices like I was, you can bully this dude hard the first time you meet him, but if you try and do the same thing with his brother in the Defiled Chalice, you're not gonna last long. Aggression does not work with this dude. He has a lot of counters for when you're right on top of him, and he's constantly moving himself out of position to not allow you to do that. So I pulled out an old strategy that I had used on one enemy before, the Amygdala in the Nightmare Frontier. The strategy was to use my Saw Cleaver in the longer mode to smack his head when I got the chance. Now, hitting the amygdala in the head provides bonus damage, but the watchdog has additional armor on his face, so you do minimal damage on the 1 or 2 hits that you land. So this becomes a battle of attrition. You tap his head and get ready to dodge. From time to time, this dude will start vomiting lava, which allows you to run to the sides and smack his legs. Most of the time, you can get in 2 or 3 hits. If you're lucky, you can stagger him and get in some bonus hits. But this battle is all about not being greedy. Hang back, take your hits when you can, until finally the beast falls. So finally, after aggression being the answer for so many bosses in the Chalice dungeon, the game was starting to challenge me in other ways. By the way, the watchdog killed me 15 times. Then came the third and final boss of this dungeon, which was another amygdala. Having faced this dude before, and having faced the watchdog 1 level back, I felt that this dude was best handled by once again using the longer saw cleaver, stay back until he lowers his head, then move in to smack it. The room you fight this guy in is relatively large, and it's easy to avoid getting hit. In fact, there were whole rounds where I got this dude to half health, all without taking a single hit. His first phase is pretty easy, but once he rips his arms off, gaining even more reach, you naturally want to back off. Because of this, the window for hitting his head becomes tighter. You'll either miss the timing, or you'll hit but be too close for the quick follow-up. And this dude hits hard. Very often can this dude one-hit kill you, which is why I was failing more often than not. Eventually I realized that this strategy wasn't working. It was reliable until I got to his second phase, but after that it was just too much. So I had to try something new. Or more specifically, I had to try something old. Aggression. After facing 2 bosses that had conditioned me to play it safe, now I was forcing myself to get up close and personal. I kept going for the amygdala's tail. As long as I stayed behind it, it was easy to keep its attacks away from me. If it jumped, I would just stay still because his head would come safely down on top of me where his tail used to be, which would leave it open enough to get some attacks on. Using this aggressive strategy is how I was able to best this boss, all because I tried something that wasn't working, which forced me to adapt. This, in my opinion, is From Software at its best. Playing a game the same way over and over is boring, and I've always praised games on introducing new enemies that require different strategies to overcome. Bloodborne is no different. Its brilliant boss battles were back, and I was having fun by being tested against significant challenges. That being said, despite the fact that there were some quality boss fights within the Chalice dungeons, the dungeons themselves are super lackluster. In the end, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. I eventually called the Chalice dungeons done after I faced Queen Yharnam herself, who you might recognize from some of the main game cutscenes. Her fight was unique in the sense that she would make copies of herself, but it wasn't very hard to defeat her. I actually charged into the first encounter expecting to die, but I didn't. I was able to defeat her on my first attempt. Next was the Old Hunters DLC. The DLC area is not only a sort of alternate reality of the Cathedral Ward, it's also populated by old hunters who have succumbed to the dream, trapped in an endless loop of hunting and killing as it is all that defines them, chief among them being Ludwig the Accursed, the first of the Healing Church hunters, not only consumed by the blood of the hunt but warped by it, shifted and changed into an abomination of man and beast. Now this fight was something else. It felt as if the game was like, oh, you want aggressive? How's this for aggressive? As soon as the fight starts, Ludwig is charging at you, giving you barely any moment to breathe. Backing off and trying to find time to heal alone feels like a risk. Ludwig is an aggressive enemy that seemingly doesn't want to let up. The second you try to back off and try to put some distance between you and him, this guy is already trying to close the gap. His leaping attack alone is the stuff of nightmares because you'll be panicking over where he's going to drop, and if it lands, it's most likely going to end your run. And that's just his first phase. In his second phase, Ludwig pulls out a giant magic sword that has range attacks and some devastating AoE moves and becomes Ludwig the Holy Blade. If you couldn't get a moment to breathe before, this dude will hit you with a barrage of magic attacks that will force you to be closer just to have a better chance of getting around him when the big moves hit. Of course, that puts you at a risk of just simply being hit with the attacks, but the answer to this giant man beast is aggression, and also knowing when to back the f*** up. I'm not kidding, I thought the Watchdog of the Old Lords was bad, but apparently Ludwig had killed me way more times than he did. Though now that I've said that, I did find myself curious about how many times I died to the other bosses in the game, so I went back and figured it out. Coming in at last place, being beaten on the first attempt, are 17 of the 23 Chalice dungeon bosses that I faced anyway, which include the headless bloodletting beast, both of the Thumerian descendants and their elder, and Queen Yharnam herself, but they are not alone. Also being beaten within the first attempt are the following: the Witch, or Witches, of Hemwick, the Shadows of Yharnam, Dark Beast Parl, the Nightmare Frontiers Amygdala, Murgo's Wet Nurse, Ebrita, Starter of the Cosmos, and from the DLC, living up to their name, are the Living Failures. Okay, so two other bosses that I beat on the first attempt are Father Gascoigne and Lady Maria, but here's the catch. I put a little star next to both of their names because, for one, Father Gascoigne wrecked my the first time I ever played Bloodborne, but on subsequent playthroughs, I've managed to beat him within the first attempt 3 times. Since I don't have any of my old footage anymore, I can't tell you how many times he wrecked me in the past, so even though on my most recent playthroughs he's never been able to kill me, he still gets credit for giving me a hard time the first time I ever played. As for Lady Maria, the opposite is true. I did legitimately beat her on my first attempt, however when I recently faced her again, she was quite the roadblock. I spent hours recently trying to beat her and getting increasingly more frustrated because I couldn't understand why this boss that I had beaten once before so easily was suddenly giving me problems now. Unfortunately, since I didn't need footage of me fighting her, I didn't capture the gameplay, which means I don't know how many times she killed me. However, she's still gonna get the honorable mention here. Moving on! Next up at having the honor of killing me at least once are the following bosses. The One Reborn, the second of the 3 Watchers in the Chalice Dungeons, which is also the first time I died to a boss in the Chalice Dungeons. Martyr Ligarius, Rom's appearance in the Chalice Dungeon. Speaking of Rom the Vacuous Spider, his official boss battle in the main game is the only boss that killed me twice. As for killing me 3 times, we have the Cleric Beast and Vicar Amelia. At defeating me 4 times, we have Mikolash, you cowardly little bastard with your bull one-shot attack. The Chalice Dungeon's Undead Giant with the chain cannonballs for back. Lawrence, the first Vicar from the DLC, and the Moon Presence, which should have been a much easier fight if I hadn't been so greedy all the time. With 6 failed attempts, we have the Bloodstarved Beast, which is also going to get an honorable mention for derailing my first run at the game and obviously killing me way more times than just 6 back then. And surprisingly, the Orphan of Kos is just above at 7 kills. I expected this to be a much more brutal and frustrating battle, but it only took me 8 attempts to beat him. By the way, check out the video of me facing the dreaded Orphan of Kos here. Now we get to the good stuff with the top 5. In 5th place is the Amygdala with 9 kills. 4th place is the Keeper of the Old Lords with 12 kills. And in 3rd place is Watchdog of the Old Lords with 15 kills. All 3 from the Defiled Chalice Dungeon. That terrible place of nightmares. And finally we have Gurman, the first hunter, bringing in the silver medal with 16 kills. And of course, in 1st place, with the gold medal of being the most frustrating boss in all of Bloodborne for me, is Ludwig with 23 excruciating murders of me. F you, Ludwig. F you. Here's the thing about the bosses in From Software games. Overtaking a boss on the first attempt is obviously going to be satisfying. Failing a handful of times is to be expected. Such was the case for the rest of the DLC bosses, namely Lawrence and Orphan of Kos, both of which killed me a handful of times, but I never got frustrated. I just kept learning from each failed attempt. I watched and studied my opponent, learning their moves and which left the right opening to strike. But with bosses like the Keeper, Watchdog, Gurman, and Ludwig, they all achieved a level of frustration that would probably make most players just quit. But there is always that small glimmer of hope that you know you can do this, so you just keep going until finally, after a dozen or more attempts, you finally topple the boss, and the excitement is everything you were fighting to achieve. Not just to move forward and progress in the game, but knowing that you got good enough to defeat this boss in this game. This is why I play From Software games, and why I love Dark Souls, and why I love Bloodborne. You know the battles are going to be brutal. You know that when you start the fight with the infamous Orphan of Kos that he's going to be absolutely relentless in his assault. That, like Ludwig, you need to answer his aggression with your own. When Dark Souls teaches you to play it safe by hiding behind your shield and wait for the right moment to strike, Bloodborne says, okay, keep that in your back pocket, but do it this way. Get in there and attack. It's designed to make you play a From Software game differently. It even rewards you for this by having the mechanic where you can get the health you recently lost back by quickly countering. But it's also a balancing act. Okay, yeah, most of the bosses can be thwarted by a crazy onslaught, but not every boss can. Bloodborne knows that it needs to keep players on their toes. After easily defeating the One Reborn, Mikolash, the Amygdala, and Murgo's Wet Nurse, the game suddenly throws Gurman at you. Then, if you've taken the right steps, it curves again by throwing the Moon Presence at you. In the Chalice Dungeons, you'll rip through most of the bosses but hit a wall with the Defiled Watchdog, who will answer your aggression by actively moving to a place where you can't get in your offense and putting you in a vulnerable position. Rom is protected by his spiders while also having a devastating range attack to watch out for. Even though Bloodborne encourages you to be aggressive to play a From Software game differently than the previous, it also likes to throw its occasional curveballs. At the time of doing my review, I saw the fact that Bloodborne was frequently pushing me to be more aggressive as a negative, but looking back, I see the point of it. Even on new playthroughs, bosses that once gave me trouble became easier, while bosses who were once a pushover became more challenging. I beat Lady Maria in one try the first time I faced her, but in New Game Plus she probably would have at least cracked the top 5 as one of the bosses that defeated me the most. Ludwig defeated me 23 times, but in New Game Plus it only took me 3 or 4 attempts to get by him. Bloodborne is a game that is always testing you, always forcing you to learn when you thought you already learned. There's a unique pull to it, something I haven't felt since I played the remake of Resident Evil 2. Even though I beat it, I kept coming back. I kept loading a New Game Plus to either get the endings I never got, explore the paths I never walked, and defeat the bosses I never faced. Bloodborne is addicting in a way that Dark Souls wasn't. When I beat Dark Souls, I felt that pull back. I knew that there were optional bosses that I had missed and a whole DLC that I hadn't explored, but that pull wasn't quite strong enough to get me back in. I think that's because Dark Souls taught me to be reserved, conditioned me to hide behind the shield and kill most enemies with bug bites rather than get in there and slash away. Bloodborne wants you to get in there and fight. I mean, hell, the game gives you 2 weapons at the start of the game to help communicate this. Here's a melee weapon and a gun. In most games, you'll want to use the gun as your primary means of dealing damage and only melee when you have to, but in this game, the script gets flipped. Bloodborne teaches you to play a From Software game in a more fun way, and in a way that you simply don't want it to end, which is why I kept coming back for more. Before starting my 3rd playthrough, I realized that I was only 4 trophies away from platinuming Bloodborne, and the idea of platinuming a From Software game was incredibly intriguing to me. It's one thing to say you beat Bloodborne, that you bested the game and unlocked its secrets. It's another thing to say that you did all of that and overcame the DLC, that you beat Ludwig and Orphan of Kos. But it's something else entirely when you can say that I got all of the trophies, I did everything, I bested Bloodborne in a way few have. I got good enough to platinum Bloodborne. And that, my friends, is why I love Bloodborne so much, why it will now likely rank amongst my favorite games of all time, and why it is so amazing. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you would like, comment below what you thought of Bloodborne. What boss gave you the hardest time? If you don't mind, give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Make sure to hit the bell icon so you can be notified of all new video uploads. Also consider checking out one of these other recommended videos here. Thank you all once again so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.